A feared Comanche came to collect what was owed, but found a poor widow shielding her starving twins. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. The wind howled through the barren landscape, carrying with it the scent of dust and dry earth. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the jagged hills of the Texas frontier. In the distance, the faint sound of hooves could be heard growing louder with every passing second. It was a sound that no one in the area would ever mistake. This was the Comanche, feared by all who crossed their path. But this time, the warrior who rode ahead was not coming to fight. He was coming to collect. The Comanche warrior, known for his ruthless precision and deadly reputation, had been sent by a creditor to reclaim what was owed by the Whitmore family. The debt had been accumulating for years, and with every passing day, the interest grew heavier. Samuel Whitmore, a once proud rancher, had fallen on hard times. His cattle had dwindled, and the land that had once promised prosperity now barely provided enough to survive. He had no choice but to accept the offer from Jake Blackjack Morrison, a notorious outlaw who controlled much of the territory. But as the warrior rode towards the small, decrepit cabin that marked the Whitmore homestead, he did not anticipate what he would find. The widow, Claraara Whitmore, stood in the doorway, a rifle clutched tightly in her hands. Her face, weathered by years of hardship, was set in a firm expression of determination. Behind her, two young children, starving, thin, and frail, clung to her skirts. They had nothing left but their mother's love, and in that moment, Claraara knew that she would protect them at all costs. The Comanche warrior halted his horse just a few feet from the cabin. He had heard of this woman before. Whispers of her strength and resilience had reached his ears, but he had no time for such stories. The debt was overdue, and it needed to be paid. "Step aside, woman," he called out, his voice low and menacing. Claraara did not flinch. She stood her ground, her eyes locked with his. "I have nothing left to give," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her heart. "You can take my land, my cattle, but you will not take my children." The warrior studied her for a moment, his dark eyes unreadable. He could see the desperation in her gaze, the fierce protectiveness she held for her children. There was something in her that caught his attention, something that made him pause. As he dismounted, his thoughts turned. In all his years, he had never encountered a woman like this. Most would have cowered at his presence, but not her. She was different. Claraara took a deep breath, knowing that the warrior could strike at any moment. But she would not back down. Not now, not when her children's lives were at stake. The warrior reached into his pouch and pulled out a small piece of paper, an official document that sealed the fate of the Whitmore family. "Your husband's debt is mine now," he said, holding it out to her. Claraara's gaze shifted to the children behind her, their eyes wide with hunger and fear. She could not let them see her break. Not now. With a steady hand, she took a step forward and reached for the paper, her fingers brushing against the warrior's hand. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The air between them was thick with tension, but there was something else, an understanding, a silent acknowledgement that neither one would give up. She stood her ground, knowing that no matter what, she would protect her family. And in that moment, the Comanche warrior did something unexpected. He did not take her children, nor did he press the matter of the debt. Instead, he offered her a choice. "You and your children may leave," he said quietly, "or you may stay, and I will ensure that you are safe." Claraara blinked in confusion, unsure if she had heard him correctly. The warrior's eyes softened just a fraction, as if he had seen something in her that made him question his orders. "I do not offer this lightly," he added, "but I will not let you die here." For a long moment, Claraara stood in stunned silence, the weight of his words sinking in. The warrior, the feared Comanche who had come to collect what was owed, had offered her something more valuable than gold. He had offered her and her children a chance at life. "I apologize for the confusion in the previous response. Here is the revised version as requested." The Comanche warrior stood silently, his dark eyes fixed on Claraara as she processed his unexpected offer. The wind howled around them, swirling dust and dry leaves in a dance that seemed to match the tension in the air. Claraara could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of her decision pressing heavily on her shoulders. She glanced at her children, still standing behind her, their faces pale from hunger and fear. This was no ordinary offer, and she knew it. The warrior's reputation had preceded him, and now here he stood, offering a lifeline she had not anticipated. Her thoughts raced, but she had no time to hesitate. The thought of leaving with nothing but the clothes on her back and her children was unbearable, yet staying meant being at the mercy of this man who could easily take everything from her. But his offer, his promise of protection, was something she had never imagined she would hear. Was it a trick? Or was he genuinely offering her a chance to live? "What's the catch?" Claraara asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. The warrior looked at her with piercing eyes, his expression unreadable. "No catch," he said simply. "You are free to choose. Leave, and you will be on your own. Stay, and I will make sure you and your children survive." Claraara took a step back, glancing at her children once more. They needed food, they needed warmth, and above all, they needed safety. The life they had known was gone, and she had nothing left but the will to protect them. Could she trust him? Could she trust this warrior, this stranger who had come to collect what was owed, and yet was now offering her more than any man in her life ever had? She was desperate, but she was also proud. She had never been one to rely on others, but the fierce protectiveness she felt for her children overpowered any pride she had left. "I will stay," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. The warrior nodded, the faintest flicker of approval crossing his face. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Unfolding it, he revealed a piece of bread and a handful of dried meat. "For your children," he said, offering it to her. Claraara hesitated for a moment, then took the food, her hands trembling. She had not realized just how hungry they were until now. She tore off a small piece of bread and handed it to her children, who devoured it eagerly, their faces lighting up with the first real nourishment they had in days. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The warrior did not speak, but his expression softened. He had seen many families struggle, many mothers fight to protect their children. But something about Claraara's determination had caught his attention. She was not like the others he had encountered, and he admired that. "You will be safe here," he said at last, turning his gaze back to the horizon. "But there is work to be done. We will start tomorrow. For now, rest." Claraara nodded, still in disbelief at the turn of events. She had no idea what the future would hold, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a flicker of hope. The next morning came with a sense of urgency. The warrior kept his promise, and Claraara found herself learning new skills she never thought she would need: how to hunt, how to gather, how to survive in the wild with her children by her side. The days passed slowly, but with each one, she grew stronger. The warrior remained by her side, never speaking much, but always watching, always ensuring their safety. As the weeks went by, Claraara began to trust him, and though she would never forget the life she had lost, she started to build a new one that was shaped by the strength of her children and the warrior's unexpected protection. In time, Claraara became a part of the Comanche tribe, a symbol of survival, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between mother and child. The warrior, once feared by all, had become her protector, and in the end, he had given her more than just survival. He had given her a chance at a new life. I will now provide the third part of the story as requested, ensuring it follows the structure and writing techniques without violating any YouTube content policies. As the days passed, Claraara's life began to shift in ways she had never imagined. What had once been a life of fear and uncertainty was now rooted in something stronger: resilience. The warrior had kept his word, and in return, she had made the difficult choice to stay, to trust him, and to let him teach her the ways of survival. The winds had shifted, and Claraara felt the deep, calming rhythm of life settling into her bones. She no longer had to fear the next knock on the door or the looming threat of creditors. Her children, though still thin, had smiles on their faces again, something Claraara hadn't seen in weeks. Their hunger had been eased, and their laughter, A sound she thought she'd lost forever now filled the air around the cabin. Yet, despite the newfound peace, Claraara couldn't help but feel the weight of the world on her shoulders. The world outside her small, protected space was still dangerous, still unforgiving. And as much as the warrior had promised her safety, Claraara understood that promises only held as much weight as the people who made them. There was an air of unease that lingered around her protector, something unspoken in the way he moved and the silent moments he shared with her. Claraara knew that he carried a burden, one he would not speak of, one that had been carved into the fabric of his very being. It was only when she caught him staring into the horizon one evening, as the sun dipped low, that she finally saw the depth of his struggle. His eyes were far away, haunted by something she couldn't understand. "What do you see?" Claraara asked, her voice breaking the silence. He turned to her, his face unreadable. "I see what could be," he said, his words slow, as if each one carried a weight too heavy to bear. Claraara didn't ask him to explain. She already knew that he would only share what he was ready to. The days blended into each other, and soon Claraara found herself learning more than just survival. She learned to be a part of something larger than herself. She learned to trust her instincts, to live off the land, and to find strength even in the most difficult moments. The warrior, who had once seemed like an untouchable force of nature, now felt like a part of her world. He became a constant presence, his steady guidance leading her through each task. He didn't speak much, but in his quiet way, he taught her how to see the world differently. Every morning, he would guide her through the dense woods, teaching her how to track animals, how to read the signs of the land, and how to defend herself if the need ever arose. His movements were swift and precise, like a shadow moving through the trees, and Claraara quickly learned to mimic his actions. She knew, deep down, that survival wasn't just about feeding her children. It was about mastering the environment and understanding the balance of nature. She also noticed how he kept his distance from her, never letting their relationship cross beyond the boundaries of what was necessary. Claraara wondered if it was because of her circumstances, or if it was his own way of protecting her. But even in his distance, there was care, there was protection, and there was respect. One evening, as the sun was setting and the sky turned the color of fire, Claraara felt a sudden pang of sadness. She looked at the warrior, who was standing by the fire, sharpening his knife. "You've done more for us than anyone else ever could," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He glanced at her, but didn't say anything for a moment. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice soft but steady. "I did not do this for you," he said. "I did this because it was the right thing to do." Claraara nodded, her heart heavy with the understanding that the warrior had not come into her life for any personal gain. He had come because, in his own way, he knew what it meant to protect those who could not protect themselves. As the fire crackled between them, Claraara realized that she was no longer just a survivor. She was part of something, a family, a community, a bond that tied them together even in the harshest of times. The warrior may have come to collect what was owed, but in the end, he had given her something more valuable than anything money could buy, a chance at a future. And for that, she would always be grateful. Days turned into weeks, and Claraara's life in the wilderness began to feel more like a new reality than a survival battle. The harshness of the land had become less of a threat and more of a companion. The trees, the river, the sky, they were all familiar now, welcoming her, even in their wildness. Claraara had settled into this new rhythm, one where each day brought its challenges, but also its victories. The children were healthier, their bellies fuller, and their eyes no longer hollow with hunger. They laughed more, played more, and for the first time since the death of their father, Claraara saw in them a glimpse of the life they might have had if fate had been kinder. Yet, as the days passed, Claraara couldn't ignore the feeling that something was changing. She noticed the warrior's movements becoming more guarded, his eyes more distant, and his moments of solitude growing longer. He no longer sat by the fire with them as often, choosing instead to disappear into the trees or by the riverbank for hours at a time. His silence, once comforting, now felt like a wall between them. One evening, Claraara found herself alone by the fire with only the crackling of the flames to keep her company. The children had fallen asleep inside, wrapped in the warmth of blankets. She stared at the fire, lost in thought, when she heard a sound, a rustle in the trees behind her. Her heart raced, instinctively reaching for the knife the warrior had given her. But it was only him, emerging from the darkness, his eyes catching the flickering light of the fire. "Where have you been?" Claraara asked softly, her voice betraying the worry she felt, but had kept hidden. The warrior did not answer right away. He simply looked at her, his face unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, carrying the weight of something unspoken. "I've been thinking," he said, his gaze drifting toward the dark horizon. Claraara frowned, sensing the change in him. "About what?" He was quiet for a long moment. "About what comes next." Claraara didn't know what to say. What was there to say? They had come so far, but this world was still dangerous. It wasn't like the one they had known, and it was still far from being safe. But they had each other now. She had her children, and he had given them the tools to survive. She had to believe that would be enough. But somehow, his words echoed in her mind, leaving a hollow space where certainty once was. The next day, Claraara woke to an unsettling silence. The air was still, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. As she went about her morning chores, she noticed that the warrior was nowhere to be found. His horse was still tethered to the tree, but his rifle and supplies were gone. A cold shiver ran down her spine. The feeling of unease that had been growing over the past few days now settled deep in her chest. She had been expecting this. Perhaps it was inevitable. The warrior had always been a man of few words, a loner in his own right. But Claraara had hoped, foolishly it seemed, that he might stay. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She turned, relief flooding her as she saw the warrior emerge from the trees. He didn't look at her as he approached, his expression as unreadable as ever. Claraara felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "You're leaving, aren't you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He stopped in front of her, but didn't answer right away. His eyes were distant, lost in the same horizon he had stared at the night before. "It's not that simple," he said, finally meeting her gaze. "I have to go." Claraara felt her heart break in an instant. "Why? What's out there for you?" The warrior's gaze hardened. "I have my own path to walk. There are things I must face." Claraara's breath caught in her throat, the weight of his words heavy between them. She had known he was a man of honor, but she hadn't understood the depth of his burden until now. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. He looked at her then, and for the first time in what felt like forever, his eyes softened. "I'm not alone," he replied, his voice low but firm. "Not anymore." Claraara didn't know what he meant, but in that moment, she understood that this man, this warrior, was more than just a protector. He had become part of her world, a part of her story, and no matter where his path took him, she would carry that part with her always. As he turned to leave, Claraara couldn't stop herself from calling out to him. "If you leave, will you ever come back?" The warrior paused, his back still turned. Without looking at her, he answered in a voice that only she could hear. "I will return when the time is right." With that, he disappeared into the trees, leaving Claraara alone with her children, her thoughts, and the memory of a promise that hung in the air like the setting sun, waiting for the day it would be fulfilled. Weeks passed, and Claraara's life, though still shadowed by the warrior's departure, began to stabilize. The children had adjusted to their new life, their laughter filling the cabin each day as they grew stronger and more vibrant. The food from the land was plentiful, and Claraara's skills as a hunter and gatherer had blossomed. She found solace in the routine of everyday life, but the absence of the warrior, her protector, still lingered in the air like a phantom. She had grown accustomed to his presence, to the quiet strength he provided, and now, without him, the silence felt almost oppressive. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow in the distance, made her heart race with a mix of hope and dread. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something she wasn't prepared for. Her children often asked where he had gone, and each time, Claraara's response was the same: "He will return." But in her heart, doubt was creeping in. One morning, as Claraara and the children gathered firewood near the edge of the forest, she noticed something strange. There were fresh tracks in the dirt, large, heavy footprints that led toward the cabin. She felt a chill run through her spine, her fingers tightening around the axe she carried. It was not the warrior's tracks. These were the prints of someone else, someone unfamiliar. Claraara motioned for the children to stay close as she silently followed the trail. The tracks wound through the trees, growing deeper as they led closer to home. Her pulse quickened. She knew better than to ignore her instincts. As she approached the clearing near the cabin, she saw a figure standing by the fire. At first, she froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure was tall, cloaked in a dark, worn coat, and from the distance, she couldn't tell if it was friend or foe. But then, the figure turned, and Claraara's breath caught in her throat. It was him, the warrior. He was back. The years of survival had hardened him further, his face more worn than she remembered, his eyes carrying a deeper weight, a silent pain that spoke volumes. For a long moment, neither spoke. Claraara simply stood there, staring at him, the words stuck in her throat. The warrior's gaze softened, but only slightly. "I told you I would return," he said, his voice low, rough from disuse. Claraara didn't know whether to feel relief or fear. She had been waiting for him, but now that he was here, she wasn't sure what this meant for her, for the children, for their future. "You've been gone so long," she finally managed, her voice trembling. "What happened? Where did you go?" The warrior's expression darkened. "There are things I had to do," he replied, his eyes shifting to the ground. "Things I couldn't leave unfinished." Claraara stepped closer, her heart aching with the need to understand. "What things?" she asked. "What could be so important that you couldn't return sooner?" The warrior looked up at her, his gaze intense. "Things that could destroy everything we've built here," he said quietly. "I didn't want to bring that danger to you, to your children." Claraara felt her breath catch in her throat. She had hoped that his return meant safety, but now she realized that the danger hadn't gone away, it had only changed shape. She couldn't bear the thought of losing this fragile piece, this new life they had built. "Then why come back now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why now, after everything?" The warrior took a step forward, his hand reaching out, but stopping just short of touching her. "Because it's time to face what's coming," he said, his voice filled with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. "The danger has followed me here. And now, I need your help." Claraara's heart pounded. She had known that the warrior was a man of mystery, that his past was filled with darkness and bloodshed, but she hadn't realized the extent of it until now. She had hoped that they could live in peace, away from the violence of the world. But now, it seemed that peace was nothing more than an illusion. "What do you need me to do?" Claraara asked, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. The warrior looked at her for a long moment, as though weighing his options. Finally, he spoke. "I need you to stay here with the children. Protect them. Keep them safe. The danger that's coming, it's bigger than anything we've faced before." Claraara felt her heart sink. She had thought that her life, their life, would be enough to keep the danger at bay. But now, she knew that nothing was ever truly safe. "I can't stay here and do nothing," she said, the words fierce with determination. "I've fought too hard to just stand by while you face whatever's coming. I'll fight beside you." The warrior regarded her for a moment, his eyes searching hers, as if looking for something. Trust, maybe, or perhaps an understanding. Finally, he nodded. "Then we face it together." Claraara knew that the moment she had feared had arrived. The past had caught up with them, and there was no escaping it. The warrior had returned, but with him came a storm that threatened everything they had worked for. But she was no longer the helpless widow she had once been. She was a mother, a survivor, and she would stand by him, no matter what came next. The next morning, the air felt heavier than usual, thick with the kind of tension that only comes when something is about to change. Claraara stood at the edge of the cabin, her gaze drifting over the land that had once been her sanctuary. Now, it felt different. The warrior was back, and with him, the threat that had followed him for so long. Claraara felt a coldness settle in her chest as she watched him prepare, gathering his supplies in silence. The quiet had become familiar to her, a steady rhythm in the chaos of survival. But now, there was a sense of urgency in his movements, a need to act quickly before whatever was coming caught up to them. "We need to move quickly," the warrior said, his voice low as he turned toward Claraara. "There's no time to waste. The enemy is closing in." Claraara nodded, her heart racing. She had known this day would come, the day when the peace they had fought for would be shattered. But she wasn't going to sit by and let it happen. She had seen too much, learned too much, to be passive now. "What do we need to do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. The warrior looked at her, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her feel like she could see into the depths of his soul. "You protect the children," he said, his tone firm. "I'll take care of the rest." Claraara felt a sharp pang of fear. She had promised herself that she wouldn't be helpless again, that she would fight if it came to that. But the warrior's words carried weight, a promise to shield her from what was coming. She knew that protecting her children was the most important thing she could do. Still, the urge to stand beside him, to face whatever danger was coming, was too strong to ignore. "I can help," she insisted, her voice low but resolute. "I won't stand by while you fight this alone." The warrior's gaze softened, just for a moment. "I need you to stay alive," he said quietly, as if the words were more difficult for him to say than anything else. "We're stronger together, but only if you're safe." Claraara didn't know if she was relieved or frustrated, but she knew he wasn't going to let her join him in the fight. With a deep breath, she nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of his request. She would protect the children. That was all that mattered. But as the warrior moved off into the trees, Claraara's mind raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that the threat was bigger than they realized, that the warrior was trying to shield her from something far more dangerous than just the immediate danger. She had to know more. She had to be ready for whatever was coming. After what felt like an eternity, the warrior returned to the cabin, his face grim. "They're here," he said simply. Claraara's heart sank. She had expected this moment, but it didn't make it any easier. The enemy had arrived. She glanced at the children, who were huddled together by the fire, unaware of the danger approaching. She moved quickly to them, crouching down beside them. "Stay close to me," she said softly, her voice steady. "We're going to be fine. Just stay close." The children nodded, their wide eyes filled with trust and fear. Claraara took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. The warrior moved quickly, his form blending into the trees, his movements fluid and precise. Claraara didn't know what to expect, but she knew one thing. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The sound of footsteps in the distance grew louder, and Claraara felt a chill run through her body. The enemy was getting closer, and there was no turning back now. She glanced over at the warrior, who had positioned himself at the edge of the clearing, his rifle in hand, his eyes scanning the horizon. She knew he was ready, but she wasn't sure if she was. The children were still close, their tiny hands gripping hers as they waited for whatever came next. Claraara's thoughts raced as she considered her options. There was no escaping now, no running from what was coming. She had to face it, just as she had faced every challenge before. But this time, she was no longer alone. She had the warrior, and more importantly, she had her children. They were her reason to fight, her reason to survive. The footsteps grew louder, and Claraara's heart pounded in her chest. She glanced up at the warrior, who gave her a single nod, signaling that it was time. The battle was about to begin, and this time, they would fight as one. The warrior's sharp eyes scanned the horizon as the sound of footsteps grew louder. Claraara could feel her pulse quicken, her grip tightening around the small knife she had kept close. She had never faced an enemy like this before, faced with the unknown, the terrifying prospect of fighting for their survival. The children huddled close to her, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear, but there was no turning back now. The warrior was ready, and she was ready, too. He had taught her how to survive, how to face down fear and fight back with everything she had. And now, it was time to use that knowledge. "Stay behind me," the warrior said, his voice low and commanding. Claraara nodded, her breath steady as she shifted her attention to the trees around them, watching for any signs of movement. The children clung to her, their hands trembling, but they trusted her. They trusted that she would keep them safe. The enemy was close now, their figures emerging from the trees like dark shadows moving stealthily through the underbrush. Claraara's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. She had to think, had to be ready. The warrior raised his rifle, his eyes locking onto the first figure who appeared in the clearing. Without hesitation, he fired, the shot ringing out through the still air. The sound of the rifle echoed in Claraara's ears, sending a jolt of fear through her. She had never heard anything so loud. She flinched, but the warrior was already moving again, reloading with practiced precision. Claraara's instincts kicked in as she spotted another figure moving toward them. Without thinking, she stepped forward, throwing herself into the fight. The knife felt heavy in her hand, but she wasn't about to let fear stop her. She had learned from the best. She had learned from him. The warrior had taught her how to strike with precision, how to use the terrain to her advantage, how to protect her family at all costs. And now, as the first enemy drew near, Claraara reacted. She lunged forward, her knife flashing in the dim light. The figure staggered back, surprise written across his face as Claraara's blade met its mark. He cried out in pain, but Claraara didn't wait to see the result. She had to move, had to protect her children. Her heart raced as she took cover behind a nearby boulder, the knife still gripped tightly in her hand. The warrior was moving swiftly and silently, taking down enemy after enemy with deadly precision. Claraara could see the way he moved, fluid, like a shadow, always one step ahead of his opponents. But even with his skill, there were too many of them. They kept coming, surrounding them from all sides. Claraara could hear their gruff voices calling out in the distance, the sound of weapons being readied. This wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a fight for their lives. Claraara glanced at the children. They were hiding behind the cabin, as she had instructed them, but she knew they were terrified. The last thing she wanted was for them to witness violence, to see the horrors of war that she had seen all her life. But there was no choice. This was their world now, and they had to fight for it. The warrior's voice cut through the air, low and steady. "Stay hidden," he called out to Claraara. His back turned as he fired another shot into the advancing enemy. Claraara nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She would stay hidden, but she would also fight. For them. For the future. Another enemy emerged from the trees, and this time, Claraara saw him before the warrior did. She reacted instinctively, throwing herself into the fray once more. The knife felt like an extension of her arm, a tool of survival, of protection. She ducked and weaved, using her surroundings to her advantage. She had been training for this, every day, for weeks. And now, she had to use everything she had learned. The enemy advanced, but they were no match for her or the warrior. With every move, with every strike, Claraara felt herself growing stronger, more confident. She was no longer the helpless widow. She was a fighter. She was a protector. As the battle raged on, Claraara's thoughts remained focused on the children. They were the reason she was here, the reason she fought. She could hear their cries in her mind, their faces flashing before her eyes. The warrior was still by her side, fighting fiercely, but Claraara knew this was only the beginning. They had to survive this. And with the warrior's help, she would do whatever it took to protect the family she had built, to give her children the future they deserved. The fight stretched on, the sounds of gunfire and shouts filling the air. But slowly, the enemy began to retreat, their numbers dwindling as they realized they were not going to win. The warrior's rifle went silent for a moment as he scanned the battlefield, and Claraara, her breath ragged from the effort, did the same. They had won, for now. But Claraara knew the danger was far from over. The warrior had promised to protect them, and he had kept that promise. But she also knew that there was still much more to be done, and the fight was far from finished. The victory felt hollow, as though the battle had been a brief interruption in a much larger war. The warrior stood by the edge of the clearing, his eyes scanning the horizon as he wiped his rifle clean. Claraara watched him silently, her mind still racing from the chaos that had just unfolded. The enemy had retreated, but it was clear that this was not the end. The warrior's warning still echoed in her mind. The danger was far from over. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, Claraara's thoughts turned to her children. They had hidden in the cabin during the battle, their wide eyes peering out from the cracks in the door, filled with fear and confusion. She had done everything she could to protect them, but now, she felt the weight of what she had just been through. She could see it in their faces, the questions they were too afraid to ask. Had they seen death for the first time? Had they felt the fear she had tried so hard to shield them from? The warrior moved toward her, his footsteps soft against the dirt, his gaze steady but distant. He had already returned to his usual silence, as though the battle had been nothing more than another task to complete. But Claraara knew it was more than that. She had seen the way his eyes had hardened, the tension in his movements. He was ready to fight again if necessary, but she wasn't sure if he would ever be the same. "We need to move," he said simply, his voice low and urgent. Claraara nodded, but a part of her wanted to stay, to find a moment of peace, even if it was only for a few hours. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. The warrior turned to her, his eyes locking with hers. "We have to keep moving. The danger is still out there, and we're not safe here." Claraara felt a pang of frustration. It seemed like the moment they found safety, it was ripped away from them. She had hoped that this time, they could settle down, build something that was theirs, without the constant threat of violence. But now, she understood that it wasn't that simple. The world they lived in didn't allow for peace. It was a harsh reality, one she had learned to accept long ago. She turned to the cabin, her gaze lingering on the small structure that had been their home, the place where she had fought so hard to protect her children. But there was no time to dwell on it. They had to move. "We'll leave at first light," the warrior said, his voice firm, but there was something softer in his eyes. Claraara could see the fatigue etched on his face, the weight of the battle still pressing on him. He wasn't invincible, and neither was she. They were just two people, trying to survive in a world that seemed to constantly test them. The night was quiet after the battle, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the distant calls of the animals in the wilderness. Claraara sat by the fire, her children nestled beside her, their heads resting against her shoulder. She watched the flames dance, her mind wandering to the future. What would it look like for them? Would they ever be free of the dangers that followed them? Would they ever find a place to call home? The warrior sat across from her, his posture tense, his gaze fixed on the fire. He had been through so much, and Claraara could see that he was carrying a burden far heavier than the one she could see. He had lost something along the way, something that had shaped him into the man he was now. But what that was, she could only guess. He had never shared much about his past, and she hadn't pressed him. She knew that some things were better left unspoken. As the fire burned low, the warrior stood up, his figure silhouetted against the dark sky. "Get some rest," he said. "We leave at dawn." Claraara nodded, her eyes following him as he disappeared into the trees. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to face it alone. The warrior might not share everything with her, but he had shown her that he was willing to fight beside her. And that was enough. Claraara pulled her children closer, wrapping them in the warmth of the blanket as they settled for the night. She closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. The fear, the uncertainty, it all weighed on her, pulling her deeper into a restless sleep. The next morning, Claraara woke before the sun, the warrior's figure already visible as he prepared their supplies. The world around them was quiet, still, as though waiting for the next storm to roll in. The air was heavy with tension, the weight of the unknown pressing in on them. Claraara rose from her spot by the fire, her children still sleeping soundly beside her. She had no idea where they would go next, but she knew they couldn't stay here. The danger was still out there, and they had to keep moving. "Are you ready?" the warrior asked, his voice calm but steady. Claraara took a deep breath, her heart steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "I'm ready." Together, they packed up what little they had and set off into the wilderness once more, the path ahead uncertain, but their resolve unbroken. They had survived the battle, but the war was far from over. The journey was harder than Claraara had anticipated. The land they traversed was unforgiving, and every step felt like a reminder of the danger that still loomed over them. The air was thick with the scent of dry earth and pine, the wind whipping through the trees as they moved deeper into the wilderness. The warrior, ever silent, led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the environment, his movements deliberate and calculated. Claraara kept close behind, her children by her side, their faces still marked by the fear they had not yet shaken. It was clear that they had seen too much, experienced too much, for children so young. But Claraara couldn't stop, couldn't give in to the exhaustion or the fear. She had to keep moving. The warrior's presence was a steadying force, but it was also a reminder that they were not safe, not yet. He had warned her that danger would always follow them, and Claraara understood now that he was speaking from experience. His past had caught up with them, and it wasn't finished yet. They had to stay ahead of it, stay one step ahead of the storm that seemed to follow them wherever they went. That afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, Claraara noticed a shift in the warrior's demeanor. He had stopped at the edge of a clearing, his eyes narrowing as he looked around, his hand instinctively resting on the rifle strapped to his back. Claraara felt a chill run down her spine. She knew something was coming. The warrior turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Stay close," he said, his voice low but urgent. Claraara nodded, instinctively pulling her children closer. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's movement ahead," he replied, his gaze still fixed on the trees. "I can feel it." Claraara felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew that he was not one to speak lightly. If he sensed something, it was because it was there, lurking just beyond the tree line. The warrior slowly crouched down, signaling for her to do the same. Claraara dropped to the ground, her heart racing, her breath shallow as she tried to steady herself. The children instinctively huddled around her, their wide eyes filled with fear. They could sense it too. Something was coming. The warrior's eyes never left the trees as he reached for his rifle. "Stay down," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Claraara watched him, her mind racing as the world around them seemed to grow quieter. The air was thick with tension, and every rustle of the leaves made her flinch. Time seemed to stretch out, the seconds feeling like hours as they waited, the silence pressing in on them. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. Claraara's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the tall, dark shape. Another warrior. The man moved with the same fluid grace as the warrior who had protected them, but there was something different in his demeanor. He wasn't hostile, but he wasn't a friend either. Claraara's breath caught in her throat as the warrior stepped into the clearing, his eyes scanning the area. He was not alone. Behind him, a small group of men emerged from the trees, their weapons drawn, their faces hidden behind masks of war paint. Claraara felt the children tense beside her. She could hear their soft breaths, the fear in their chests rising with every passing second. She could feel it too, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. The warrior who had been with her stood, slowly, and Claraara's heart pounded in her chest. She watched him closely as he stepped forward, his movements calculated. He did not draw his rifle, but he did not relax either. The leader of the group, a tall man with streaks of red war paint across his face, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the warrior. "You have come far," the leader said in a language Claraara didn't understand. The warrior who had been with her responded, his voice calm, but filled with authority. "I have no interest in your lands," he said. "I seek only peace." The leader of the group tilted his head, his eyes studying the warrior. There was a long pause as the two men exchanged a tense silence. Claraara's breath caught in her throat. She did not know what was being said, but she could feel the tension between them, the unspoken history that hung in the air. Finally, the leader spoke again, his tone low but respectful. "You seek peace," he said. "But peace comes with a price." Claraara's heart sank. She could see the way the warrior's eyes hardened, the way his jaw clenched. He had come so far, but now it seemed like the peace he had sought was slipping through his fingers. The leader's eyes shifted to Claraara and the children, his gaze lingering on them for a moment before he turned back to the warrior. "Your peace is not mine to give," the leader said. "But I will offer you this. Leave this place, and I will not harm your family." Claraara felt a cold sweat break out on her skin. She had no idea what this man wanted or what price they would have to pay for this peace. The warrior remained silent for a moment, his face unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "I will not leave," he said. "Not without them." The leader nodded once, as though he had expected this answer. The tension in the air thickened, and Claraara felt herself hold her breath, unsure of what was coming next. She could only pray that the warrior's resolve would hold, that he would keep them safe, no matter what. The leader's eyes flickered with something, recognition, perhaps, or understanding. Then, with a single motion, he raised his hand, signaling for his men to stand down. "Then we will see if your peace is worth the price," he said, his voice cold but not hostile. The warrior did not flinch, did not take a step back. He stood firm, his gaze unwavering as the leader's men began to disperse. The danger, for now, had passed. But Claraara knew that this was only the beginning. The storm was coming, and they would have to face it together. The tension that had filled the air dissipated only slightly as the leader of the group signaled for his men to stand down. Claraara exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, but the sense of unease still gripped her. The warrior beside her remained as still as ever, his face set, unreadable, as the leader and his men backed away into the woods. The silence that followed felt like a fragile truce, one that could shatter at any moment. The warrior finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "We'll leave at dawn. It's not safe here anymore." Claraara nodded, but something gnawed at her insides. She had learned to trust the warrior, to trust his judgment. But the danger was growing, and it was no longer just the threat of the enemy. It was the weight of everything they had lost, everything they had yet to face. As they made their way back to the cabin, Claraara's mind raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that the leader's words had been more than just a warning. There was something deeper, something he hadn't said. She glanced over at the warrior, who was preparing their things, his movements efficient, as though he had done this 1,000 times before. But his eyes betrayed him. They were clouded, distant, as though he was carrying a burden he couldn't put down. "What did he mean?" Claraara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The warrior didn't look at her, but she could feel him tense at her question. "He meant exactly what he said," he replied, his voice low and cold. "They want something from us. Something that goes beyond this land." Claraara's heart skipped a beat. "What do they want?" she pressed, her fear rising again. The warrior paused for a moment, as though considering how much to reveal. "There's a history between my people and theirs," he said finally, his eyes meeting hers. "One that goes back far before I ever met you. They have unfinished business with me." Claraara's chest tightened. She had known there was something about the warrior's past that haunted him, something he was trying to outrun. But this felt different. The weight of his past was catching up with them, and it wasn't going to let them go. "What does that mean for us?" Claraara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It means we have to be ready," the warrior replied, his voice steady, but his eyes flickering with something darker. "It means that the fight we've been avoiding is coming, and we won't be able to outrun it." Claraara swallowed hard. She had known the day would come when they couldn't hide from the past anymore, but she hadn't imagined it would come so soon. She had hoped that the warrior's presence, his protection, would be enough. But now, it seemed like they were standing on the edge of a storm, one that was about to break. The night passed slowly, each minute dragging as Claraara lay awake, her mind spinning with the unknown. The warrior had kept watch, his rifle close at hand, his senses alert for any sign of danger. But Claraara couldn't sleep. She kept hearing the leader's words echoing in her mind. "Your peace is not mine to give." She had been hoping that they could find some semblance of normalcy, some peace for her children. But now she understood that peace was a fleeting illusion in a world like this. The warrior was right. There was no outrunning what was coming. As dawn broke, Claraara stood by the fire, preparing what little they had left for the journey ahead. She could feel the warrior's presence beside her, but he hadn't spoken since the night before. He was lost in his own thoughts, just as she was. She turned to him as he approached, the sun casting a warm glow over his face. "We're leaving now?" she asked, her voice steady, though the uncertainty lingered in her chest. He nodded. "We leave now? It's our best chance." Claraara didn't question him. She knew he was right. The danger had already arrived, and they couldn't afford to wait any longer. The warrior moved to gather the children, his gaze softening as he looked at them. For a moment, Claraara saw a flicker of something deeper than the warrior she had come to know. There was something in his eyes that made her realize just how much he cared, not just for her, but for her children as well. He didn't show it often, but in those moments, Claraara saw the man behind the warrior. As they set off, Claraara felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. The trail ahead was uncertain, the road never clear, but she knew one thing: they would face it together. The warrior had promised her safety, but now, more than ever, she understood that his promise came at a cost. The past was a shadow that stretched long behind them, and no matter how far they went, it would always follow. But Claraara wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the warrior, not of the world, and certainly not of the unknown. She had already fought for her children's survival. She had already faced death, and she would face whatever came next with the same strength, the same determination. Together, they would fight, and together, they would survive. The path ahead was difficult, the rugged terrain a constant reminder of the danger that still loomed over them. Claraara walked silently beside the warrior, the weight of the world pressing on her shoulders. They had been moving for hours, the children trailing behind them, tired but determined. The warrior had not spoken much since their departure, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Claraara could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation of something just beyond their reach. The unknown had a way of following them, creeping up when they least expected it. She had learned not to ask too many questions, not to push the warrior for answers. His silence was something she had come to accept, but it didn't make the fear that clung to her any easier to bear. Every step they took felt like it was leading them further into a storm that was coming whether they were ready or not. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the landscape. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the promise of rain. Claraara pulled her cloak tighter around her, trying to block out the cold that seemed to seep into her bones. She glanced at the children, who were clinging to each other as they trudged along the trail. Their faces were drawn with exhaustion, their small feet moving sluggishly through the dirt. Claraara knew they had to stop soon. They needed rest. But the warrior had a purpose in his stride, and she knew better than to question it. She had learned to trust him, even in the face of uncertainty. It was the trust that kept them going, the hope that, together, they could make it through whatever came next. "We'll stop up ahead," the warrior said, his voice as steady as ever. Claraara nodded, her heart lifting just slightly at the prospect of a break. They had been traveling for so long, without rest, the constant movement wearing on her. But even as she looked forward to a moment of peace, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The world around them was too still. The birds had stopped singing, the animals had gone silent. Claraara's instincts kicked in, and she found herself scanning the trees, her grip tightening around the knife she carried. The warrior paused as if sensing her unease. He turned to look at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Something's not right," Claraara whispered. The warrior didn't answer right away. He simply nodded, his expression hardening as he surveyed the area. "Stay close," he said, his voice low but firm. Claraara didn't need to be told twice. She moved closer to the children, pulling them in tightly as they huddled together. The air seemed to grow thicker with each passing moment, the stillness unbearable. Claraara could feel the tension in her muscles, the anticipation of something about to break. The warrior stepped forward, his rifle in hand, his eyes scanning the trees once more. Then, with a sudden motion, he turned and signaled for Claraara to follow him. Without a word, she did, her heart pounding in her chest. The children followed close behind, their eyes wide with fear. Claraara glanced at them, trying to reassure them with a smile, but the uncertainty in her chest was impossible to hide. They moved quickly, silently, the warrior leading the way with careful precision. Every step was measured, every sound analyzed. Claraara stayed close, her breath shallow, her senses alert. They had only walked a few hundred yards when the warrior stopped abruptly. Claraara almost bumped into him, but he held up a hand, signaling for her to remain still. She froze, her heart racing as she scanned the area. There, just ahead, a figure moved through the trees. It was cloaked in shadows, but the outline was unmistakable. A man, a stranger. Claraara's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected anyone to be out here, not this deep into the wilderness. And yet, there he was. The warrior's hand moved to his rifle, his gaze never leaving the figure. Claraara felt a knot form in her stomach. Who was this man? What did he want? The warrior didn't hesitate. In a swift motion, he raised his rifle, aiming carefully. But just as Claraara thought he would fire, the man stepped forward, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I mean no harm," the man said, his voice calm but with a hint of desperation. The warrior lowered his rifle slightly, his eyes still wary. "What do you want?" he demanded. The man hesitated before speaking, his eyes darting nervously between Claraara and the warrior. "I've been following you," he said. "I know who you are, and I know what's coming. I'm here to help." Claraara felt a chill run through her. Who was this man, and how did he know so much about them? She instinctively moved closer to the warrior, seeking the protection that had always been there. The warrior looked at the man, his expression unreadable. "Help?" he repeated, as if testing the word. "Why should we trust you?" The man lowered his hand slowly, taking a step forward. "Because I know the danger that follows you," he said. "And I know that you can't face it alone." The warrior remained silent, studying the man. Claraara felt her breath catch in her throat. She didn't know if she could trust him, but something in his eyes made her think that he wasn't lying. "Who are you?" the warrior asked finally. The man hesitated, his eyes flickering with something Claraara couldn't quite place. "My name is Adam," he said quietly, "and I've been sent to warn you." Adam's words hung in the air like a fog, thick with unspoken truths and promises of things to come. Claraara felt her heart race, her instincts screaming at her to be cautious, but something in the man's eyes stopped her. He wasn't like the others. She could sense that much. The warrior remained unmoving, his expression unreadable, but Claraara could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his grip tightened on his rifle. "You've been following us?" the warrior asked, his voice low, skeptical. Adam nodded, his eyes flickering between Claraara and the warrior. "For days. I know what's coming for you," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "The danger you're running from, it's not just out here in the wilderness. It's bigger than that. It's closer than you think." Claraara's breath caught in her throat. "What danger?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. Adam's eyes darkened. "The same people who sent me after you. They've been tracking you for longer than you realize. And they won't stop until they have what they want." The warrior stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Adam. "What do they want?" he demanded. Adam looked at him, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face before he spoke again. "They want you," he said quietly. The word struck Claraara like a blow. She glanced at the warrior, seeing the muscles in his jaw tense, his eyes narrowing with a hard, cold resolve. "Why?" the warrior asked. "What do they want from me?" Adam's voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "I don't know the full story," he said, "but I know they want something you have, something that makes you a threat to them, and they won't stop until they've taken it from you." Claraara felt a chill settle in her bones. She had known that the warrior's past was full of shadows, things he hadn't shared with her, but this was something deeper, something far more dangerous than she could have imagined. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Adam took a deep breath, his face hardening. "We run," he said. "We move quickly, stay off the roads, and get as far away as we can. They'll be watching the main paths, waiting for you to make a mistake. But if we move fast, we can lose them. They're not invincible." The warrior was silent for a long moment, his eyes locked on Adam. Claraara couldn't tell if he was considering the man's words or calculating the risks of trusting him. "And if we don't?" the warrior asked, his voice as cold as ice. Adam's gaze hardened. "Then they'll find you. And when they do, they'll destroy everything you've built, everything you've fought for." Claraara's mind spun with the implications of what Adam was saying. They had been living in the shadow of danger for so long, trying to stay hidden, trying to build something for her children. But now it seemed that the danger was closer than ever. It was no longer just about surviving day to day. It was about a fight that was coming for them, one that would require everything they had to stand against. She looked at the warrior, who stood silent for a moment longer before nodding. "We'll leave," he said finally. "But we leave now. No more waiting." Claraara felt her heart sink. There was no turning back now. The danger had already caught up with them, and the only way forward was into the unknown. "What's the plan?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Adam's expression softened slightly, though his eyes were still filled with urgency. "We'll head north, into the hills. There's a safe place, a small camp where we can regroup. From there, we make our way west. It's a long journey, but it's the only chance we have." The warrior nodded again. "Lead the way," he said, his voice firm with the same resolve Claraara had come to expect from him. Adam didn't hesitate. He turned and began moving, leading the way through the thick trees, his steps sure and swift. Claraara followed closely, her children at her side, her mind racing with the weight of what was ahead. The warrior was close behind her, his presence a steadying force in the chaos of their flight. As they moved through the trees, the sounds of the forest felt muted, as though the world had fallen into a heavy silence. Claraara's senses were on high alert, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig making her jump. The air felt thick with danger, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. The journey was long, the terrain rough, but they pushed on, moving quickly through the underbrush, staying hidden from sight. They couldn't afford to stop, couldn't afford to make a sound. Claraara kept her children close, whispering reassurances to them even as her own heart pounded with fear. Hours passed, and the light began to fade, the sun dipping low in the sky as they continued their journey into the unknown. Claraara felt the exhaustion settling into her bones, but she kept moving, kept pushing forward, driven by the need to protect her family, to survive. The warrior and Adam moved like shadows, silent and efficient, always on the lookout for danger. Claraara could feel the weight of their presence, their watchful eyes keeping her and her children safe. But she also knew that the real threat was still out there, waiting. They were running, yes, but there was no guarantee that they would outrun it. And with each step they took, the shadow of the past loomed closer, a reminder that the battle they faced was far from over. They had been traveling for what felt like days, but Claraara's sense of time had blurred. The landscape was a mix of dense trees and rocky terrain, and they moved like shadows under the cover of the thickening dusk. Adam led the way, his movements quiet and efficient, while the warrior kept close, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Claraara's heart was heavy with fear, and despite the warrior's assurance that they were heading towards safety, she couldn't shake the sense of impending danger. Every crack of a branch underfoot, every gust of wind that rustled through the trees, made her jump. The children, weary and confused, walked beside her, their steps slow and hesitant, but Claraara could feel their trust in her, their reliance on her strength. She wasn't going to fail them now. They had reached the hilltop just as the sun began to set, painting the sky with streaks of red and purple. The warrior paused, looking out over the landscape below, and for a moment, Claraara thought she saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. But he quickly masked it, turning to her. "We'll stop here for the night," he said, his voice steady but his eyes scanning the horizon. "We'll move again at dawn." Claraara nodded, but the unease she had been carrying in her chest didn't ease. She knew they were close, but she also knew that being close to safety didn't mean they were safe. She looked at the children, her heart aching as she watched them slump to the ground, too tired to protest. They needed rest, they needed food, but most of all, they needed reassurance. Claraara crouched down beside them, brushing the dirt from their faces. "We're going to be okay," she whispered to them, her voice filled with the calm they needed to hear. "We're together, and that's all that matters." The warrior moved off to the side, kneeling beside Adam as they began to set up a small campfire. Claraara watched them, her mind racing with thoughts of the danger that still loomed. She had come to trust the warrior, to rely on his instincts, but she couldn't help but wonder if this was truly over. The world around them felt too quiet, too still. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Claraara shifted uneasily, her fingers tightening around the knife she still carried. It had become a part of her now, just as the warrior's rifle was a part of him. They were always ready, always prepared for the worst. As the fire flickered and cast shadows across the clearing, Adam turned to the warrior, his face grim. "We can't stay here long," he said. "They'll be looking for us." The warrior nodded, his gaze hardening. "I know, but we need to rest, just for a few hours. Then we move again." Adam hesitated, glancing at Claraara, his expression filled with something that looked like doubt. "Do you think we can outrun them?" The warrior's eyes met his face as cold as ever. "We have to," he said simply. Claraara felt a shiver run down her spine. The finality in the warrior's voice made her realize just how much was at stake. They weren't just running from the past anymore. They were running from their lives. The fire crackled, and Claraara's thoughts swirled in the quiet night. She had hoped, for so long, that they could find peace, that the worst was behind them. But now, it seemed like the worst was just beginning. She turned her gaze to the horizon, the darkening sky stretching endlessly before her. There was nowhere to hide anymore. The danger was here, and it would follow them wherever they went. The warrior and Adam continued to speak in low tones, discussing their next move, but Claraara couldn't focus on their words. All she could hear was the pounding of her heart in her ears. She was scared of the danger, scared for her children, and even scared of what the warrior's silence meant. But there was no time for fear now. She had to stay strong. For them. The children stirred, and Claraara glanced down at them. They were both asleep now, their small bodies curled up beside her, trusting her completely. She couldn't let them down. She would protect them. She would survive, no matter what came next. The night passed in uneasy silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire. As the first light of dawn touched the sky, Claraara rose, her muscles stiff from the cold. The warrior was already awake, his eyes scanning the surroundings. Adam was packing up their belongings, his face set with determination. There was no time to waste. The warrior turned to her, his gaze softening just slightly. "We'll be ready to move in 20 minutes, he said. Claraara nodded, her heart heavy but her resolve unbroken. They were far from safe, and the road ahead was uncertain, but they had made it this far together. And together, they would keep moving, no matter where the journey led. The warrior had promised to protect them. She trusted him. But now, more than ever, Claraara knew that it wasn't just about survival. It was about finding hope in the darkest of places, about holding on to each other when the world seemed determined to tear them apart. And as the dawn broke over the hills, Claraara took a deep breath, ready to face whatever came next. In this thrilling journey through the unforgiving wilderness, Claraara and her children find themselves constantly on the run, facing dangers from the past and uncertain threats in the future. This intense story, filled with suspense, survival, and heart-pounding action, draws readers into a world of hardship and courage. As they fight to stay alive, they encounter new allies, make tough choices, and confront fears that have haunted them for far too long. The warrior, whose past is filled with dark secrets, continues to protect Claraara and her family, but the danger following them is relentless. With every step, they are faced with new challenges that test their strength and resilience. This narrative is a perfect example of what makes Western stories so compelling: the survival, the battles, and the unbreakable will to survive in a brutal world. Each twist and turn keeps the reader on edge, longing to know what will happen next. Will they be able to outrun the past, or will the shadow of danger finally catch up to them? The suspense builds, and the stakes grow higher in this story of survival in the wild, where every moment counts. For fans of Western stories, this tale offers all the gripping elements that define the genre: a harsh landscape, unexpected enemies, and characters who will fight to the bitter end for survival. From the first encounter with danger to the final moments of uncertainty, this story delivers the thrills that Western stories are known for. As Claraara and her family move forward, the future remains uncertain, but their fight for freedom and peace never wavers. This is one of those Western stories that you won't want to put down until the very last word.